Here's a fact that will make you question everything you know about ancient history. The underwater structures at Yonaguni were submerged at the end of the last ice age, meaning if they are man-made, they would predate Stonehenge by over 7,000 years. This single discovery has the potential to rewrite our understanding of human civilization entirely. Tonight, we're taking you on the complete journey through Yonaguni's history, from its volcanic birth in the Pacific depths to the underwater terraces that continue to spark fierce scientific debates. But before we dive in, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like and subscribe button if you haven't already. Your support means we can continue producing these highly researched videos to help you learn something new or pass the time. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. So without further ado, let's begin, shall we? The birth of an island, Yonaguni's geological origins. The ocean stretches endlessly around Yonaguni, a small speck of land at the far western edge of an island chain. Waves crash against ancient rocks. Wind sweeps across cliffs that drop sharply into the sea. This island exists because of forces so vast and slow that human time cannot measure them properly. The story begins not with people, but with the restless earth itself. The Ryukyu Arc extends over 1,000 kilometers from the southern shores of Kyushu to the northeastern coast of what we now call Taiwan. Studies show this chain of islands formed where two great plates of the Earth's crust meet. The Philippine Sea Plate slides beneath the Eurasian Plate along a subduction zone called the Ryukyu Trench. This meeting of plates has shaped the region for millions of years. Mountains rise, ocean floors buckle, islands emerge from beneath the waves. Yonaguni sits at the southwestern end of this arc. The island belongs to the Yaeyama Group, a collection of islands that share a common geological heritage. Research reveals that the bedrock beneath Yonaguni consists primarily of sandstone and mudstone. These rocks formed during the Miocene epoch, roughly 20 million years ago. At that time, sediments accumulated on an ancient continental shelf. Layer upon layer of sand and mud pressed together under immense weight. Time and pressure transformed loose grains into solid stone. The Yaeyama Group shows relatively little deformation compared to older formations in other parts of the Ryukyu Arc. This suggests a period of relative stability after the early Miocene. The southern Ryukyus have remained geologically calm for millions of years, but calm does not mean inactive. The earth beneath these islands continues to shift and settle. Small movements add up over vast stretches of time. Tectonic forces later uplifted these ancient seabed rocks. What once lay beneath the ocean now stands above it. The sandstone and mudstone that make up Yonaguni's foundation began their existence as underwater sediments. Fossils and traces of ancient marine life remain embedded in the stone. These relics speak of a time when the island did not exist as land at all. The same forces that built the island continue to shape it today. Earthquakes occur with regularity in this region. The subduction zone remains active. Tremors remind the islanders that the ground beneath their feet is not as solid as it seems. Faults crisscross the bedrock. These fractures formed when stress in the crust became too great. Rocks split along lines of weakness. The fractures created planes and joints that run through the stone in regular patterns. Water and weather have worked on these rocks for millions of years. Rain seeps into cracks. Waves pound against the coastline. Wind carries salt spray inland. These forces wear away at the stone, grain by grain. Erosion follows the natural weaknesses in the rock. The parallel bedding planes and vertical joints guide the process. Where water finds a crack, it widens it. Where waves find a fault line, they carve deeper. The result is a landscape of terraces and cliffs. The bedding planes create horizontal surfaces. The vertical joints form walls and drops. Standing on Yonaguni's coast, one can see these patterns clearly. The rocks break in straight lines. Surfaces lie flat and level. Corners meet at sharp angles. Nature has sculpted the stone along its internal structure. Similar formations appear elsewhere in the Ryukyu Arc. On other islands, the same sandstone weathers in similar ways. Geologists recognize these patterns. They understand the forces at work. The rocks respond to stress and pressure according to the laws of physics. Stone breaks, water flows, time passes. Sea levels have risen and fallen repeatedly over millions of years. During ice ages, much of the world's water locked itself into glaciers. Oceans dropped, land bridges appeared between islands. During warmer periods, ice melted. Seas rose again. Coastlines shifted inland. What lies underwater today may have been dry land 10,000 years ago. What stands above water now might someday sink beneath the waves again. The island of Yonaguni emerged from these cycles of change. Its bedrock formed in ancient seas. Tectonic forces pushed it upward. Erosion carved its features. The island we see today represents merely one moment in a process that spans geological time. The forces that created it continue to work. The island changes even now, though too slowly for human eyes to perceive. This is the foundation upon which all later history would unfold. Before humans arrived, before any living thing walked or swam near these shores, the island took shape: stone and water, time and pressure. These are the oldest forces at work on Yonaguni. They set the stage for everything that followed. The first islanders. Arrival and settlement in the Paleolithics. The seas around the Ryukyu Islands held a secret for most of human history. While continental Asia teemed with life, these islands remained distant and isolated. Reaching them required crossing open water. Yet somehow, people did exactly that. Archaeological evidence shows that humans arrived on these islands during the late Pleistocene, tens of thousands of years ago. The oldest human remains in the entire Ryukyu chain come from sites on Okinawa Island. Bones discovered at the Yamashita-cho and Sakatari cave sites date back roughly 30,000 years. At Minatogawa, archaeologists found well-preserved skeletal remains from 18,000 years ago. These findings prove that people lived in the Ryukyus during the last ice age. They survived and adapted to island life long before agriculture existed anywhere in the world. Yonaguni sits at the far southwestern end of the island chain. Reaching it from the north required multiple sea crossings. Coming from the south meant navigating from what is now Taiwan. Either route presented challenges. Open water separated the islands. Currents ran strong. Weather could turn deadly without warning. Yet people made these journeys. Recent experimental archaeology has demonstrated that such voyages were possible with Paleolithic technology. In 2019, researchers successfully crossed from Taiwan to Yonaguni using a dugout canoe built with stone tools. The journey took 2 days. They relied on the Kuroshio Current, which flows northeastward past the island. This experiment showed that ancient peoples could have made similar crossings using only the materials and skills available to them 30,000 years ago. Evidence suggests multiple migration routes into the Ryukyus. Some people may have come from the north, island hopping down from Kyushu. Others possibly arrived from the south, traveling up from Taiwan or beyond. The southern route would have brought people with connections to Southeast Asian cultures. The northern route linked the islands to the populations of the main archipelago. Genetic studies of ancient remains reveal connections in both directions. DNA analysis shows that Paleolithic people in the Ryukyus share affinities with populations from Southeast Asia. This supports the idea of southern migration routes. At the same time, later periods show clear connections to populations further north. The picture that emerges is one of multiple waves of movement across many thousands of years. Life on Yonaguni during the Paleolithic would have been challenging. The island is small, resources were limited, the surrounding seas provided fish and shellfish. The land offered whatever plants, animals, and fresh water could be found. Archaeological sites elsewhere in the Ryukyus give us clues about what these earliest islanders might have eaten and how they lived. Excavations at Sakatari Cave on Okinawa revealed shell artifacts dating to the Paleolithic period. People fashioned tools from shells. They made scrapers, fish hooks, and even beads. Evidence shows they consumed freshwater crabs seasonally. They understood the rhythms of the island environment. They knew when and where to find food. Stone tools appear at Paleolithic sites throughout the Ryukyus. People made flakes and pebble tools. They used these for cutting, scraping, and processing food. The technology was simple but effective. Without metal, without pottery, these early islanders survived using only stone, bone, shell, and wood. Sea levels during the Paleolithic stood much lower than today. At the peak of the last ice age, oceans dropped by more than 100 meters. Much of what now lies underwater was dry land. The islands were larger. Some may have been connected by land bridges. The coastline looked different. What we see today is not what the first islanders saw. This means that many Paleolithic sites now lie beneath the sea. Storms and rising waters have buried or destroyed them. The archaeological record is incomplete. We find only what survived on high ground or in protected caves. The full story of these earliest inhabitants remains partly hidden. What we do know tells us that people were here. They crossed dangerous waters to reach these islands. They adapted to life in a challenging environment. They passed their knowledge down through generations. They were the first humans to look out over the waves from Yonaguni's shores. For thousands of years, these Paleolithic populations lived as hunter-gatherers. They moved with the seasons. They followed the fish. They gathered what the land provided. Their numbers remained small. Resources were limited. The carrying capacity of a small island restricts how many people it can support. Then, around 12,000 years ago, the world began to warm. The last ice age ended. Glaciers melted, sea levels rose, coastlines retreated inland. Some land bridges vanished beneath the waves. The islands became more isolated. The descendants of those first arrivals had to adapt once again. Despite these changes, people remained on the islands. They did not disappear. They continued their way of life, adjusting to new conditions. The archaeological record shows signs of their presence extending forward through time. They were still here when the next great changes began to arrive from the north. The Jomon influence. Cultural currents from the north around 7,000 years ago, a new cultural tradition began to spread into the northern Ryukyu Islands. People from Kyushu brought with them a distinctive way of life. They made pottery decorated with cord impressions. They lived in semi-permanent villages. They hunted, fished, and gathered with sophisticated techniques. This was the Jomon culture, and it would leave its mark on the islands for thousands of years. The name Jomon means cord-marked. The pottery these people made featured elaborate decorations created by pressing cords into wet clay. The designs varied by region and time period. Some pots were relatively plain. Others displayed complex patterns and shapes. The pottery itself represents one of the oldest ceramic traditions in the world, dating back more than 10,000 years on the main islands. Jomon influence reached the northern Ryukyus but did not extend uniformly across the entire archipelago. Archaeological evidence shows the presence of Jomon-style pottery and other cultural markers in the Amami Islands and on Okinawa Island. However, the southern Ryukyus, including Yonaguni and the other Yaeyama Islands, remained largely outside this sphere of influence during most of the Jomon period. This created a cultural boundary within the island chain. The northern islands experienced contact and exchange with mainland cultures. The southern islands developed along different lines. Geographical distance explains this division. The Kurama Gap separates the central and southern Ryukyus. This stretch of open ocean proved difficult to cross regularly. Cultural exchange happened more easily within each group than between them. In the northern Ryukyus, people adopted elements of Jomon culture while maintaining their own island traditions. The period is sometimes called the Shell Midden culture or Kaizuka period. This name refers to the large mounds of discarded shells that accumulated near coastal settlements. These middens tell us what people ate. Shells from various marine species dominate the remains. Fish bones appear frequently. Evidence of terrestrial animals is less common but present. Pottery appears at these northern sites in styles that show clear connections to the Jomon tradition. The vessels served practical purposes. People used them for cooking and storage. The technology of firing clay transformed people could process, and preserve food. Boiling became possible. New types of meals could be prepared. Trade networks connected the islands to Kyushu. Obsidian from Kyushu appears at Ryukyu sites. This volcanic glass was prized for making sharp cutting tools. Its presence proves that people transported goods across considerable distances. Shell bracelets made from Ryukyu shells have been found in Kyushu. This indicates exchange moved in both directions. The islands exported marine products. They imported stone tools and other goods. Settlement patterns during this period suggest increasing sedentism. People built more permanent structures. They established villages near productive fishing grounds. Some sites show evidence of long-term occupation. Population may have grown slowly as people adapted their subsistence strategies to make the most of island resources. The Jomon period in the main islands lasted for thousands of years. It was not a static culture. Styles changed, technologies evolved, population densities waxed and waned. The influence that reached the Ryukyus likewise varied over time. Some periods show stronger connections than others. For Yonaguni specifically, the Jomon influence appears to have been minimal or absent entirely. The island's location at the far southwestern extreme of the chain placed it outside the regular sphere of interaction with the north. Cultural exchange with Yonaguni happened through different channels, if it happened at all during this period. The southern Ryukyus, including the Yaeyama Islands where Yonaguni belongs, followed a different cultural trajectory. Archaeological evidence from Miyako and Yaeyama shows connections to cultures further south. Some researchers see similarities to traditions from Taiwan and even more distant parts of Southeast Asia. This makes sense given the geographical positioning. Yonaguni lies closer to Taiwan than to Okinawa. Life in the southern islands during this time remains less well understood than in the north. Fewer sites have been excavated. The archaeological record is thinner. What evidence exists suggests a continued hunter-gatherer lifestyle. People relied heavily on marine resources. They used stone tools. Pottery either did not exist or was rare. One distinctive feature of the Yaeyama Islands is what archaeologists call the Shimotabaru culture, which appeared around 4,500 years ago. This culture produced a specific style of pottery different from Jomon wares. The pottery tradition lasted until about 3,500 years ago. After this period, there followed what is termed the Aceramic or no pottery era. During the Aceramic period, which lasted roughly from 2,500 to 900 years ago, people in the southern Ryukyus stopped making pottery entirely. The reasons for this remain unclear. It represents an unusual cultural choice. Most societies that adopt pottery continue using it. To abandon the technology suggests significant changes in lifestyle, population, or cultural practice. This absence of pottery sets the southern islands apart from the north during this long span of time. While Okinawa and the Amami Islands continued traditions rooted in Jomon influence, Yonaguni and its neighbors followed their own path. They were distinct. They were separate. They maintained their own way of life. The geographical isolation that kept Yonaguni outside the Jomon sphere would not last forever. Eventually, new influences would arrive. Trade would increase. Connections would form. But during the long millennia of the Jomon period, Yonaguni remained at the edge of the known world, distant from the cultural currents flowing through the northern islands. The Yayoi Revolution: Rice, Metals, and New Technologies. Around 2,500 years ago, a transformation began in Kyushu that would eventually reach across the archipelago. New technologies arrived from the continent. People brought rice agriculture, metallurgy, and new forms of social organization. This marked the beginning of the Yayoi period, named after a district in modern Tokyo where distinctive pottery from this era was first discovered. The changes came gradually. Wet rice cultivation required specific knowledge and suitable land. Bronze and iron working demanded new skills. These innovations did not spread everywhere at once. Geography, climate, and existing cultural patterns all affected how quickly and completely regions adopted the new ways. In Kyushu, the impact was immediate and dramatic. Farmers created irrigated paddies. They planted rice in flooded fields. This method produced far more food than hunting and gathering. Populations could grow. Settlements became more permanent. People accumulated surplus. New forms of wealth and social hierarchy emerged. Metallurgy brought bronze mirrors, weapons, and ceremonial objects. Iron provided tools for farming and everyday use. Axes, knives, and sickles made work more efficient. The technology came from the continent through the Korean peninsula. Trade networks carried both goods and knowledge. The Yayoi culture spread eastward across the main islands. It reached Honshu and gradually moved north. The transformation was neither uniform nor complete. Some regions adopted the new technologies enthusiastically. Others resisted or adapted them selectively. In Hokkaido, traditional hunting and gathering lifestyles persisted for centuries longer. For the Ryukyu Islands, the Yayoi impact followed a different pattern. The northern islands eventually received some influence. Yayoi pottery and a few bronze objects have been found at sites in Okinawa and Amami. However, rice cultivation did not take hold in the Ryukyus during the Yayoi period itself. The climate and terrain were suitable, but the knowledge and seeds apparently did not arrive, or if they did, people chose not to adopt them widely. Yonaguni and the southern Ryukyus remained even more removed from these changes. Archaeological evidence shows minimal Yayoi influence in the Yayama Islands. The cultural boundary that existed during the Jomon period persisted. The southern islands continued their own traditions, largely independent of developments in the north. This meant that while Kyushu and Honshu were transforming into agricultural societies with metallurgy and new political structures, Yonaguni remained a place where people lived by fishing, gathering, and hunting. Life continued much as it had for thousands of years. Stone tools remained the primary technology. Pottery either did not exist or was scarce, as the Aceramic period persisted in the southern islands. The reasons for this differential spread are multiple. Distance matters. Yonaguni lies far from Kyushu. Regular contact was difficult. The Kirama Gap and other stretches of open water served as barriers. Cultural diffusion requires repeated contact and exchange. When islands are isolated, new ideas and technologies arrive slowly or not at all. Additionally, the social and economic structures needed to support rice agriculture may not have existed in the southern Ryukyus. Wet rice farming requires collective labor. Fields must be prepared. Irrigation systems must be built and maintained. Storage facilities are needed. Political organization must coordinate these activities. A small population scattered across multiple islands may not have had the numbers or organization to make such a system work. There's also the question of choice. People do not automatically adopt every new technology they encounter. They evaluate whether it fits their needs and circumstances. For islanders already adept at exploiting marine resources, the appeal of labor-intensive farming might have been limited. Why? Why adopt rice agriculture if fishing provides adequate nutrition? Some limited exchange probably occurred. Goods from the north may have reached Yonaguni through multi-step trade networks. Items from the south may have moved north. But these contacts did not result in fundamental cultural transformation during the Yayoi period. The Yayoi transformation passed Yonaguni by. While it revolutionized life on the main islands, the far southwestern edge of the chain remained largely unchanged. People continued their traditional ways. They adapted to their environment using the knowledge and techniques they had developed over millennia. The innovations that were reshaping much of the archipelago simply did not reach them yet. This isolation would not last indefinitely. Eventually, the agricultural revolution would arrive. New crops would be planted, new tools would appear, new social structures would develop. But that transformation would come much later. During the Yayoi period itself, Yonaguni remained outside the sphere of these changes. The pattern we see repeats across the archipelago. Core regions change first. Peripheral areas lag behind. Sometimes they skip entire cultural phases. Sometimes they develop their own unique adaptations. Yonaguni's distance from the centers of innovation meant it followed its own timeline. Its people lived according to rhythms set by the ocean and the seasons, not by the planting and harvest of rice. The Gusuku era: fortresses, chiefs, and kingdoms. Around 900 years ago, the Ryukyu Islands entered a period of dramatic change. Agriculture finally spread throughout the archipelago. Rice and foxtail millet cultivation reached even the southern islands. With farming came new settlement patterns, new forms of political organization, and new types of monuments. This was the Gusuku period, named for the fortified settlements that came to dot the landscape. The timing of this transformation varied by location. In the northern Ryukyus, agriculture had begun to appear sporadically during earlier centuries. In the central islands, including Okinawa, rice cultivation became established around the 11th century. In the southern Ryukyus, including Yonaguni, the shift to farming happened later still, possibly not until the 12th or 13th century. The arrival of agriculture changed everything. Farming creates surplus. Surplus enables specialization. Some people can focus on activities other than finding food. Craft production increases, trade expands, population grows, social hierarchies become more pronounced. Those who control productive land gain power over those who do not. From these conditions emerged a new class of leaders called Aji. These chiefs ruled over farming communities. They commanded the labor needed to build and maintain agricultural infrastructure. They organized defense against rivals. They directed trade and tribute. Their power rested on their ability to mobilize resources and people. The Aji built fortifications to protect their holdings and display their status. These structures are called gusuku. The word means castle or fortress, but gusuku varied greatly in size and form. Some were simple enclosures surrounded by stone walls. Others became massive complexes with multiple baileys, elaborate gates, and buildings made of wood or stone. Construction of gusuku began with simple earthworks and wooden palisades. Over time, builders developed sophisticated stone-working techniques. They shaped blocks of coral limestone with remarkable precision. The walls they built followed the contours of hilltops. They curved gracefully. Gates incorporated arches. The craftsmanship was impressive. Hundreds of gusuku sites have been identified throughout the Ryukyus. The largest and most elaborate were built on Okinawa Island. Famous examples include Nakijin, Nakagusuku, Katsuren, and later Shuri. These fortresses controlled strategic locations. They dominated trade routes. They served as centers of political power for entire regions. The social structure of this period was hierarchical. At the bottom were common farmers and fishers. Above them stood the Aji and their retainers. Competition among Aji was frequent. Stronger chiefs absorbed the territories of weaker ones. Alliances formed and dissolved. Warfare was common enough that defensive fortifications became necessary. Trade flourished during the Gusuku period. The Ryukyus occupied a strategic position in East Asian maritime networks. Ships traveling between China, Korea, and the main archipelago passed through these waters. The islands exported marine products. Mother-of-pearl shell from Ryukyu waters was particularly prized. It was used for inlay work and luxury goods throughout the region. Chinese ceramics appeared in increasing quantities at Ryukyu sites. Korean stoneware also arrived. These imports show that the islands were connected to wider trade networks. The Aji, who controlled harbors and facilitated trade, grew wealthy. Wealth translated into power. Power enabled the construction of larger gusuku and the command of more people. Religious practices also evolved during this period. Sacred groves called utaki became important ritual sites. Female priestesses called noro conducted ceremonies. These religious figures held significant social authority. They interceded with the spirits and ancestors. Their blessings legitimized the power of chiefs. On Okinawa, the Gusuku period saw the emergence of three major kingdoms by the 14th century. Hokuzan controlled the north, Chuzan dominated the center, Nanzan held the south. This was the Sanzan period, or Three Mountains period. These kingdoms competed for territory and recognition from China. They sent tribute missions seeking the prestige and trade benefits that came with formal diplomatic relations. For Yonaguni, the Gusuku period meant the arrival of agriculture and incorporation into broader trade networks, but the island's remote location meant it remained peripheral. The large stone fortresses of Okinawa were not replicated here. Population was smaller. Resources were more limited. The scale of political organization was correspondingly modest. Evidence suggests that local chiefs emerged on Yonaguni as they did elsewhere. They would have organized agricultural production. They would have participated in trade, but they lacked the resources to build the massive stone fortresses seen on larger islands. Their power remained more limited. The island's position near Taiwan gave it potential importance in trade routes connecting the southern and northern Ryukyus. Goods moving between the Yaeyama Islands and other parts of the chain might have passed through Yonaguni. The island could have served as a way station for ships navigating these waters. However, the historical record for Yonaguni during the Gusuku period remains sparse. Few written accounts mention the island specifically. Archaeological work has not uncovered major Gusuku sites comparable to those on Okinawa. What we can say with certainty is that the island participated in the broader transformations of the era. It became part of a more connected world. By the end of the Gusuku period in the 15th century, the political landscape of the Ryukyus had consolidated significantly. The three kingdoms of Okinawa would soon unify under a single ruler. This unified Ryukyu kingdom would extend its control over outlying islands, including eventually Yonaguni. The Gusuku era laid the foundations for this larger political structure. It transformed scattered farming communities into a network of chiefdoms that could be integrated into a kingdom. The Ryukyu kingdoms reach Yonaguni as a peripheral province. In 1429, the Ryukyu Islands underwent a political transformation. Shohashi, an ambitious Aji from the central kingdom of Chuzan, conquered his rivals in Hokuzan and Nanzan. The three kingdoms became one. With recognition from the Ming Emperor, Shohashi established the Ryukyu kingdom with its capital at Shuri Castle. This unified state would endure for 4.5 centuries. The kingdom was built on trade. The Ryukyus occupied a strategic position in East Asian maritime commerce. Ships carrying goods between China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the archipelago passed through these waters. Ryukyu merchants became skilled intermediaries. They imported Chinese silk and porcelain. They exported Southeast Asian spices and woods. They facilitated exchanges that larger powers found difficult to conduct directly. The kingdom maintained tributary relationships with China. Missions traveled regularly to the Ming and later Qing courts. These diplomatic visits brought prestige and economic benefits. Chinese recognition legitimized Ryukyu rulers in the eyes of their neighbors. Trade concessions provided wealth. The kingdom prospered by maintaining good relations with the dominant continental power. From its base on Okinawa, the unified kingdom expanded its control over outlying islands. The Amami Islands to the north came under Ryukyu authority by the mid-15th century. The Sakishima Islands to the south, including Miyako and Yaeyama, were incorporated around 1500. Yonaguni, the westernmost island, became part of this expanding realm. For Yonaguni, incorporation into the Ryukyu kingdom meant new obligations. The island became a peripheral province, subject to the authority of Shuri. Local chiefs were allowed to continue governing their communities, but they now answered to the king. They were required to send tribute. They had to acknowledge the supremacy of the royal court. Tribute took various forms. Agricultural products were demanded. Textiles were collected. Whatever goods the island could produce were extracted and sent to the capital. The burden was significant for a small population with limited resources. People who had lived by fishing and farming now had to produce surplus for distant overlords. The kingdom appointed officials to oversee these peripheral territories. These administrators ensured compliance. They collected taxes. They enforced royal decrees. They represented the king's authority. Local autonomy decreased. Decisions that once rested with island chiefs now required approval from Shuri. Trade regulations affected Yonaguni as they did all parts of the kingdom. The royal court claimed monopoly rights over foreign commerce. Private trade with outside powers was restricted. Ships could not simply come and go as they pleased. Everything had to flow through official channels controlled by Shuri. For a small island near Taiwan, these restrictions were particularly onerous. Natural trade connections lay to the south and west. Yonaguni was closer to Taiwan than to Okinawa. Exchange with Taiwan would have been logical and convenient, but the kingdom's trade policies directed commerce northward to Shuri rather than across the strait to Taiwan. The political structure of the kingdom was hierarchical. The king ruled from Shuri Castle. Below him stood various ranks of aristocracy. The highest nobles controlled large estates. Middle-ranking officials administered districts. At the bottom of the aristocratic hierarchy were the officials assigned to remote islands like Yonaguni. Common people had no voice in this system. They were subjects, not citizens. Their role was to farm, fish, and pay taxes. Mobility was restricted. People could not simply leave their home islands. Social advancement was nearly impossible for those born to commoner families. Religious authority reinforced political power. The king was considered to have both secular and spiritual authority. High priestesses conducted rituals that legitimized royal rule. The Noro system of female priestesses extended throughout the kingdom. These women performed ceremonies that were believed to ensure agricultural fertility and protection from disasters. On Yonaguni, local religious traditions likely persisted alongside the official practices promoted by the kingdom. Small communities maintained their own customs even under external control. The islanders probably continued to honor their own spirits and ancestors while also participating in the royal religious system when required. Cultural assimilation was gradual. The kingdom promoted certain practices and discouraged others. Language use became more standardized over time, though local dialects persisted. Architectural styles showed influence from the center. Pottery styles changed. The kingdom's presence became visible in material culture. Military control was light but present. The kingdom did not station large garrisons on small islands. The cost would have been prohibitive. Instead, control was maintained through the tribute system and occasional displays of force. If an island resisted, military expeditions could be sent to enforce compliance. Maritime surveillance was important. The kingdom needed to monitor its waters. Pirates were a concern throughout the period. Smuggling had to be prevented. Ships passing near Yonaguni might be inspected. The islanders themselves might be called upon to report unusual activity. The strategic value of Yonaguni lay partly in its location. It marked the kingdom's southwestern boundary. Beyond it lay foreign waters. The island served as a lookout point. It was the edge of the known world for the kingdom, the last bit of controlled territory before open ocean and foreign lands. Life under the kingdom was not easy for ordinary Yonaguni islanders. They worked their fields and sailed their boats. They raised their children and honored their ancestors. But now they also had to meet tribute obligations. They had to obey distant officials. Their lives were shaped by political forces they could not control. The kingdom lasted for centuries. During this time, Yonaguni remained a peripheral province. It was never a center of power or commerce. It was simply the westernmost point of the realm, a small island whose people contributed what they could and endured what they must. The Satsuma invasion and the Edo period, a shift in allegiance. In the spring of 1609, a fleet of ships left the harbor at Yamakawa on the southern tip of Kyushu. Aboard were 3,000 warriors of the Satsuma domain. They carried guns, swords, and orders from the shogun. Their target was the Ryukyu kingdom. The invasion would change the political landscape of the region for centuries to come. The Satsuma domain, ruled by the Shimazu clan, had long claimed suzerainty over the Ryukyus. During the 16th century, relations between Satsuma and the kingdom had been tense. The Shimazu demanded recognition and support. The Ryukyu kings were cautious. They valued their relationship with China. They were reluctant to antagonize either Satsuma or the Ming court. Matters came to a head when the Tokugawa shogunate established control over the archipelago after 1598. The new government wanted to consolidate authority. It viewed Ryukyu's independent stance as unacceptable. When King Shonei refused to acknowledge Tokugawa supremacy, the shogunate authorized Satsuma to take action. The invasion force reached Amami-Oshima within days. The people there did not resist. The Satsuma army proceeded southward. They encountered opposition on Tokunoshima, where local defenders fought with spears and improvised weapons. The battle was brief and one-sided. Satsuma forces, equipped with guns and organized in disciplined units, overwhelmed the defenders. By late April, the invaders reached Okinawa. They destroyed Nakijin Castle in the north. They landed at Yomitan and divided their forces. One group moved overland toward Uraso. The other attacked Naha Harbor by sea. Defensive chains and fortifications at the harbor initially repelled the naval assault. But when the two Satsuma forces reunited, they took Uraso Castle through superior firepower and tactics. On May 4th, Shuri Castle fell. King Shonei surrendered. The invasion lasted only a few weeks. Casualties on both sides were relatively limited compared to the scale of the operation, but the political consequences were immense. Satsuma took King Shonei captive. They transported him to Kagoshima, then to Sunpu and Edo to meet with the shogun and retired shogun. This public display of submission humiliated the king and demonstrated Satsuma's dominance. In 1611, Shonei was allowed to return to Shuri, but only after signing oaths of loyalty to the Shimazu clan. The terms imposed on the kingdom were severe. The Amami Islands were annexed directly into Satsuma. They were removed from Ryukyu control permanently. The remaining kingdom became a vassal state. Satsuma officials arrived to conduct land surveys. They assessed the kingdom's productive capacity. They established tribute requirements. The kingdom entered a period of what historians call dual subordination. Officially, Ryukyu remained a tributary state of China. Ships continued to sail to the Qing court. Diplomatic missions maintained the appearance of an independent kingdom paying homage to the emperor. This fiction served Satsuma's purposes. Through Ryukyu, goods from China could enter domains of the shogunate without violating official bans on direct trade. However, real power now lay with Satsuma. A document called the 15 Injunctions detailed the restrictions placed on the kingdom. Foreign trade required Satsuma approval. Diplomatic missions needed authorization. Travel between the islands and the archipelago was controlled. Interactions between Ryukyuans and people from other domains were regulated. The kingdom could do nothing significant without Satsuma permission. For the common people of Ryukyu, including those on Yonaguni, the invasion meant increased burdens. They now paid tribute to both Satsuma and Shuri. The double extraction of resources made life harder. Agricultural production had to increase. Tax collectors became more demanding. Obligations multiplied. Yonaguni's location at the far edge of the kingdom meant direct Satsuma presence was minimal. The island was too small and remote to warrant a permanent garrison. Control was exercised indirectly through the royal court at Shuri, which itself answered to Satsuma. The chain of authority was long, but it reached even to the westernmost island. The Edo period, as the Tokugawa shogunate's rule is known, lasted from 1603 until 1867. Throughout these centuries, Ryukyu existed in an ambiguous position. Not quite independent, not quite Japanese, the kingdom navigated between Chinese and domain authority. The arrangement was unusual but stable. Trade continued despite restrictions. Ryukyu merchants still sailed to Southeast Asia. Chinese goods still flowed through Naha, but the profits now enriched Satsuma coffers more than they benefited the kingdom itself. What had been a prosperous trading state became an economic dependency. Cultural policies during this period promoted certain forms of assimilation while maintaining the fiction of Ryukyu distinctiveness. When Ryukyu missions traveled to Edo to pay respects to the shogun, they dressed in Chinese-style clothing. They performed exotic music. They presented themselves as foreign envoys. This theater supported the pretense that Ryukyu remained a separate kingdom now, merely allied with Satsuma rather than conquered by it. On the islands themselves, life continued with its own rhythms. Farmers planted and harvested, fishers cast their nets, people were born, grew old, and passed from the world. The political changes mattered deeply for those who held power, but for ordinary islanders, the immediate concerns of survival and subsistence remained paramount. Yonaguni's economy during the Edo period centered on fishing, limited agriculture, and the raising of livestock. The famous Yonaguni horse, a small, sturdy breed, grazed on the island's pastures. These horses were valued for their strength and endurance. They could survive on limited fodder and withstand harsh conditions. The island produced textiles from local fibers. Women wove cloth using traditional techniques. These textiles had value both for local use and as tribute items. The skills required were passed from mothers to daughters across generations. Sugarcane cultivation expanded during this period throughout the Ryukyus. The crop grew well in the subtropical climate. Processed sugar had high value in trade. The kingdom promoted its cultivation. For many islands, sugar became the primary cash crop and the main means of meeting tribute obligations. On Yonaguni, the scale of sugar production was limited by the island's size and population. Nevertheless, what could be produced was produced. The demands from above were constant. Meeting them required sustained effort from everyone. Social stratification remained rigid. A small class of local officials and their families occupied the top of island society. Below them were commoners who worked the land and sea. Movement between these classes was nearly impossible. Birth determined destiny. Religious life blended Buddhist, Confucian, and indigenous animist elements. Shrines dotted the landscape. Rituals marked the seasons. Ancestors were honored with offerings. The spiritual world was thought to be close at hand, influencing daily life in visible and invisible ways. The Edo period was marked by relative peace, but also by constraint. The Pax Tokugawa meant fewer wars, but it also meant strict social control. People were expected to know their place and stay in it. Questioning authority was dangerous. Challenging the system was unthinkable for most. For Yonaguni, this long period meant stability of a sort. The island remained peripheral. No great events unfolded here. History happened elsewhere. The people of Yonaguni simply endured, working their land, sailing their boats, paying their taxes, and maintaining their communities across generations. Life on the edge, traditional economy and culture of old Yonaguni. The ocean defined Yonaguni. It surrounded the island completely. It provided food. It connected the island to the wider world. It also isolated the community from that same world. The people who lived here developed ways of life adapted to this environment over centuries. Fishing formed the backbone of subsistence. The waters around Yonaguni teemed with life. Tuna, bonito, mackerel, and countless other species swam in these currents. Men set out in small boats. They used hooks, lines, and nets. The techniques passed from father to son. Knowledge of the sea accumulated over generations. The best fishing grounds lay in specific locations. Fishers learned to read the water. They understood how currents and tides affected where fish gathered. They knew which spots produced at different times of year. This knowledge was practical and essential. Without it, fishing became guesswork with poor results. Women gathered shellfish along the rocky shores. They knew which species were safe to eat and which were not. They understood when different shellfish were at their best. They collected seaweed that could be eaten or used for other purposes. The intertidal zone was a productive space for those who knew how to harvest it sustainably. Agriculture on the island was limited by terrain and climate. The land was rocky. Soil was thin in many places. Fresh water had to be carefully managed. Fields required constant maintenance to prevent erosion. Still, people grew what they could. Sweet potatoes became an important crop. They tolerated poor soil better than rice. They produced decent yields even under difficult conditions. The potato became a staple food. When other crops failed, sweet potatoes kept people alive. Rice cultivation existed, but on a small scale. The island lacked extensive flat land suitable for paddies. What rice fields existed required significant labor to create and maintain. Rice was a prestige grain. It went for tribute or special occasions more often than for daily meals. Sugarcane grew in patches where conditions allowed. Processing the cane into sugar required equipment and knowledge. Small-scale production was possible. The sugar produced had value for tribute payments and trade. Millet and other grains grew in scattered plots. Beans provided protein. Vegetables filled out the diet. People grew what would grow and made do with what they had. Livestock included the famous Yonaguni horses. These small horses, typically standing around 12 hands high, were remarkably strong for their size. They could carry heavy loads over rough terrain. They survived on coarse grass and minimal care. Farmers used them for agricultural work. They were also valuable trade goods. Cattle and pigs were raised in smaller numbers. They provided meat on special occasions and for festivals. Chickens supplied eggs and meat. Animal husbandry required resources. Feed had to be found. Shelter had to be provided. Only households with sufficient land and labor could maintain livestock. Houses were built to withstand typhoons. The structures sat low. Roofs were secured firmly. Building materials came from the island itself. Wood from local trees formed the frame. Thatch from local plants covered the roof. Coral stone provided foundations. Villages clustered in 3 main settlements, Sonai, Kubura, and Higawa. Each had its own character, but all shared the same basic conditions. People lived close together. Neighbors knew each other intimately. Privacy was limited. Social bonds were strong because they had to be. Textiles were produced locally using traditional methods. The most distinctive was Yonaguni ori, a fabric woven in complex patterns. Women spent long hours at the loom. The cloth had both practical and ceremonial uses. Particularly fine examples served as gifts or tribute items. Clothing was practical and plain for most people. Working in fields or boats required durability. Special occasions demanded better garments. What people wore indicated their social status. Officials and their families dressed differently than commoners. Diet depended heavily on what the island provided. Fish and shellfish appeared at nearly every meal. Sweet potatoes were a staple. Rice was a luxury for many. Green vegetables, when available, added variety. Fruits grew in season. The diet was adequate, but not abundant. Preservation techniques extended the life of perishable foods. Fish could be dried or salted. Vegetables were pickled. Storage in cool, dry places helped. Still, food security was always a concern. A bad fishing season or crop failure meant hunger. Tools and implements were made locally or imported at great cost. Farming tools, fishing gear, household items, all had to be acquired somehow. Metal goods were particularly valuable. A good knife or fish hook represented significant investment. People maintained their tools carefully. replacement was difficult and expensive. Medicine relied on traditional knowledge. Certain plants had healing properties. Bone setters could handle fractures. Midwives assisted with births. For serious illnesses or injuries, options were limited. Many conditions that modern medicine treats easily were life-threatening. Infant mortality was high. Life expectancy was shorter than in later eras. Religious practices combined multiple traditions. Utaki, sacred groves, served as places of worship. Spirits inhabited these spaces. People made offerings and prayed for protection, good harvests, and safe voyages. Priestesses conducted rituals at important times. Ancestor worship was central to spiritual life. The dead were not truly gone. They watched over their descendants. They required respect and offerings. Neglecting ancestors brought misfortune. Honoring them brought blessings. Festivals marked the agricultural calendar and other important occasions. These were times when the community came together. Work stopped briefly. Food was shared. Dances and music provided entertainment. Festivals reinforced social bonds and provided relief from the constant demands of survival. Marriage customs followed established patterns. Families arranged most unions. Marriage created alliances between households. Children were expected and valued. They represented the future. They would care for aging parents. They would continue the family line. Education was limited for most people. Children learned by watching and doing. Boys learned fishing, farming, and other male tasks from their fathers and other men. Girls learned weaving, cooking, and household management from their mothers and other women. Formal schooling was rare and reserved for elite families. Oral tradition preserved knowledge and history. Stories passed from generation to generation. Legends explained natural features. Myths provided moral lessons. The community's collective memory resided in the minds of elders. When they died, some knowledge died with them unless successfully transmitted. Social control operated through community pressure more than formal law. Everyone knew everyone. Reputation mattered deeply. Those who violated norms faced ostracism. Cooperation was enforced through mutual dependence. Individual autonomy was limited by collective needs. Life on Yonaguni was hard. Resources were limited. Options were few. People worked constantly just to meet basic needs. Yet communities endured. Culture persisted. The island remained inhabited through centuries of difficulty. The people who lived on this edge of the world proved remarkably resilient. Meiji modernization, Yonaguni becomes officially Japanese. In 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate fell. The Meiji emperor assumed direct authority over the nation. A new government formed, determined to modernize the country. The old feudal order would be dismantled. Domains became prefectures. Samurai lost their privileges. Western technology and institutions were imported wholesale. Everything changed, including the status of the Ryukyu kingdom. The Meiji government viewed the kingdom's ambiguous status as unacceptable. Japan was building a modern nation-state. Clear borders were needed. Sovereignty could not be shared. The fiction of Ryukyu independence no longer served any purpose. The islands would be incorporated fully into Japan. Satsuma's control over Ryukyu became an obstacle in this new order. The domain system was being abolished. Satsuma itself would cease to exist as an autonomous political unit. Its claims over Ryukyu were therefore void. The central government would handle the matter directly. In 1872, the Meiji government took the first formal step. They declared the Ryukyu kingdom to be the Ryukyu domain. King Shotai was redesignated as the domain lord. This change in terminology signaled the end of even nominal independence. The kingdom was now officially part of the Japanese administrative structure. However, this was merely a transitional arrangement. The government intended to go further. Missions were sent to Shuri to explain the new order. Officials pressured Shotai to accept his new status voluntarily. The king and his court resisted as much as they dared. They appealed to China for support. The Qing court protested but did nothing substantive to help. In 1879, the government lost patience. Police and military forces occupied Shuri. They dissolved the royal government. They expelled the king from his castle. Shotai was given a residence in Tokyo and a pension. The Ryukyu domain became Okinawa Prefecture. The kingdom that had existed for 450 years vanished from the map. This event is known as the Ryukyu disposition. It was done administratively, without war, but also without the consent of most Ryukyuans. For people who had identified as subjects of the Ryukyu kingdom, the change was profound and disorienting. They were now Japanese. Their identity had been redefined by bureaucratic decree. For Yonaguni, the practical changes took time to manifest. The island was remote, government resources were limited. Integrating the former kingdom into the Japanese administrative system required building new institutions from scratch, sending officials, establishing schools, creating systems of taxation and land registration. None of this happened overnight. New administrative divisions organized the prefecture. Yonaguni became part of Yaeyama District. Later, it would be designated as part of Yaeyama-gun, which included the other islands of the Yaeyama group. Local governance structures had to adapt to Japanese systems. The education system underwent transformation. The Meiji government prioritized schooling as a means of creating loyal citizens. Schools were built throughout Okinawa Prefecture, including eventually on Yonaguni. Children learned Japanese language, history, and values. The curriculum promoted identification with the Japanese nation. Previously, education had been limited and informal. Now it became compulsory, at least in theory. Getting children to attend regularly proved challenging in remote areas. Families needed child labor for farming and fishing. School seemed less important than survival. Attendance was often poor, especially during busy seasons. The language question was particularly contentious. The Ryukyuan languages were not mutually intelligible with standard Japanese. On Yonaguni, people spoke their own distinct dialect. Forcing children to learn and use standard Japanese in school created difficulties. Teachers often came from the main islands and struggled to communicate with students. The policy aimed at linguistic assimilation, but implementation was uneven. Conscription was introduced, although it initially did not apply to Okinawa. Later, men from the prefecture would be drafted into the military. This marked a significant change. Previously, military service had been limited to the samurai class. Now, all able-bodied men were potential soldiers. This created new burdens on families and communities. Taxation systems were reformed. The old tribute system was replaced with monetary taxes and land assessments. The government surveyed land holdings. They determined values. They assessed taxes accordingly. The burden did not necessarily decrease, but its form changed. Money became more important than goods in kind. Infrastructure improvements came slowly. The government built some roads and port facilities. Communication systems were gradually extended to remote areas. However, investment in Okinawa lagged behind the main islands. Resources were concentrated where population and economic activity were greatest. Peripheral areas like Yonaguni received minimal attention. Economic changes accompanied political changes. Restrictions on trade were lifted in some respects, but increased in others. The old patterns of Ryukyu commerce were disrupted. New markets opened in the main islands. Steamships began to replace sailing vessels. The pace of economic change accelerated. For Yonaguni, proximity to Taiwan became both opportunity and complication. Taiwan had been ceded to Japan after the Sino-Japanese War of 1895. This made the strait between Yonaguni and Taiwan an internal waterway within the Japanese Empire for a time. Trade increased. People moved between the islands. Some Yonaguni residents went to Taiwan seeking opportunities. Traditional industries on the island faced new pressures and opportunities. The horses of Yonaguni found markets in Taiwan and elsewhere. Fishing could now sell to wider markets, but competition also increased. Larger operations with better equipment could produce more efficiently. Small-scale island producers sometimes struggled. Cultural changes were perhaps the most profound. People were told they were Japanese, but they did not feel Japanese. Customs and practices that had been normal for centuries were now deemed backward or uncivilized. Traditional dress was discouraged in favor of modern clothing. Religious practices that differed from mainstream Shinto or Buddhism faced pressure. Resistance to these changes was largely passive. People continued traditional practices in private while conforming in public when necessary. Overt opposition was dangerous. The government had power to punish those who resisted too openly. Most people adapted outwardly while maintaining continuity inwardly. The Meiji period represented the first phase of Yonaguni's integration into the modern Japanese state. The transformation was neither complete nor entirely successful during this era. The island remained peripheral, resources were limited, But the process had begun. Yonaguni was no longer merely the westernmost island of Ryukyu. It was now the westernmost island of Japan. This would shape everything that followed. The Pacific War, Yonaguni's role and sacrifice. In 1941, the empire went to war. The conflict that engulfed the Pacific touched every corner of Japanese territory, including the remote islands of Okinawa Prefecture. Yonaguni, despite its small size and peripheral location, could not escape the war's reach. The island's proximity to Taiwan gave it strategic significance. Its people would pay a heavy price. The initial years of war brought little direct impact to Yonaguni. Fighting occurred far away in the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and the Central Pacific. Life on the island continued with its usual rhythms. But as the war progressed and the empire's fortunes declined, military planners turned their attention to defending the home islands and their approaches. Okinawa Prefecture became a critical defensive zone. The islands formed a barrier between the advancing American forces and the home islands. Military installations proliferated throughout the prefecture. Airfields were built, fortifications were constructed, troops arrived in increasing numbers. Yonaguni received military attention because of its location. The island lay along potential invasion routes. Its position near Taiwan made it useful for surveillance and coordination. The Imperial Japanese forces established facilities on the island. Soldiers were stationed there. The civilian population had to accommodate this military presence. The construction of military facilities required labor. Islanders were mobilized to build fortifications. They dug trenches. They moved earth and stone. The work was hard and uncompensated. Everyone capable of physical labor was expected to contribute. Refusal was not an option. Food production became increasingly difficult as resources were diverted to military needs. Young men who would normally fish or farm were either conscripted or assigned to military construction projects. Fields were sometimes requisitioned for military use. The burden on remaining civilians increased. Shortages became severe. Supplies from outside the island dwindled as shipping became dangerous. American submarines patrolled the surrounding waters. Ships carrying food or other necessities risked being targeted. The island became increasingly isolated and desperate for basic goods. By 1945, the situation had become dire. American forces had taken Iwo Jima. They were poised to invade Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa began in April and would rage for nearly 3 months. It became one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. Okinawa's civilian population suffered catastrophically. Yonaguni was not a major battlefield, but it felt the war's effects. American aircraft operated in the region. Air raids, while not as intense as those on the main island of Okinawa, occurred. People took shelter when planes appeared. The sound of distant explosions carried across the water. Communication with the outside world became nearly impossible. The island was cut off. News arrived sporadically, if at all. Rumors spread. Fear was constant. No one knew what would happen next. Military personnel on the island prepared for possible invasion. They believed fighting to the end was their duty. The civilian population was caught between military demands and their own need to survive. Some military units treated civilians harshly, commandeering what little food remained. Malnutrition became widespread. Children showed signs of starvation. The elderly were particularly vulnerable. Disease spread more easily among weakened populations. Medical supplies were non-existent. People suffered and passed away from conditions that could have been treated under normal circumstances. When the war finally ended in August 1945, relief mixed with uncertainty. The fighting had stopped, but what came next? The emperor's announcement of surrender reached the island eventually. Military personnel had to be disarmed and removed. The occupation would bring new challenges. The immediate post-war period was chaotic. The economy was shattered. Normal trade had ceased. Food remained scarce. The American military government that took control of Okinawa Prefecture had limited resources to devote to small islands like Yonaguni. People were largely left to fend for themselves. Surprisingly, the island experienced a brief economic boom in the late 1940s. Smuggling across the strait to Taiwan flourished. The border became porous. Goods moved back and forth illegally. People with boats could make significant profits. The population temporarily swelled as people came to participate in this underground trade. Ships carried goods to Taiwan and returned with other products. American military supplies were diverted and sold. Taiwanese goods found markets throughout Okinawa. The trade was technically illegal, but enforcement was lax initially. For a few years, Yonaguni became a bustling smuggling hub. The boom did not last. As authorities cracked down on smuggling, the trade declined. By 1949, the prosperity had faded. People who had come for quick profits departed. The population dropped. The island returned to its previous economic marginality, now with the added burden of war damage and social disruption. The human cost of the war years was significant. While Yonaguni did not experience the level of devastation that Okinawa main island suffered, people still passed away. Soldiers and civilians alike did not survive. Families lost members. The trauma of those years affected the entire community. Infrastructure that existed before the war was damaged or neglected. What the military had built served military purposes, not civilian needs. Roads were poor, port facilities were inadequate, buildings were in disrepair. Reconstruction would take years and required resources the island did not have. The social fabric had been torn. Traditional authority structures were weakened. The war had disrupted normal life so thoroughly that returning to previous patterns proved impossible. Young people who survived the war sometimes had different ideas about how life should be lived. The old certainties no longer seemed certain. Yonaguni emerged from the war diminished. The population had declined. The economy had collapsed. Infrastructure was damaged. The psychological scars would take generations to heal. The Pacific War had reached even this distant island, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. Post-war struggle and American administration. The guns fell silent in August 1945, but peace did not immediately follow. For Yonaguni and the rest of Okinawa Prefecture, a new period of uncertainty began. American forces occupied the islands. They would remain in control for 27 years. During this time, the islands existed in a strange limbo, separate from both the United States and Japan. The occupation began with the immediate need to address humanitarian crises. Food shortages plagued the islands. Infrastructure was damaged or destroyed. Displaced persons needed housing. Disease threatened to spread among weakened populations. The American military government faced enormous challenges with limited resources. On Yonaguni, the situation was difficult but not as catastrophic as on Okinawa main island. The Battle of Okinawa had devastated that island. Hundreds of thousands had perished. Cities were rubble. The social order had collapsed completely. Yonaguni had been spared the worst of the fighting, but it still suffered from years of wartime deprivation and disruption. The United States Civil Administration of the Ryukyu Islands was established to govern the occupied territory. This administration operated separately from the military government of Japan proper. Okinawa was split from the rest of the country administratively. The islands remained under American control even after the main islands regained sovereignty in 1952. This separation created unique circumstances. Yonaguni was Japanese culturally and historically, but it was not legally part of Japan during the occupation. Residents carried special identification documents. Travel to the main islands required special permission. Trade was restricted. The islands operated under different laws and regulations. Currency issues complicated economic life. Initially, American military scrip circulated alongside Japanese yen. Later, a special currency called B-yen was introduced for use in Okinawa. Exchange rates fluctuated. People lost confidence in paper money. Barter remained common, especially on remote islands like Yonaguni. Land usage became a contentious issue throughout Okinawa Prefecture. The American military needed land for bases. They requisitioned property, sometimes with minimal compensation. While Yonaguni did not host major military installations during most of the occupation, the island was not entirely free of military presence. Facilities for communications or surveillance existed. The military maintained a watch over these strategic waters. Education resumed gradually. Schools reopened with American oversight. The curriculum was revised to remove militaristic content. Democratic values were promoted. English language instruction was emphasized. For children on Yonaguni, access to education improved compared to the war years, though resources remained limited. The economic situation in the early post-war years was desperate. Traditional industries had been disrupted. Fishing boats were damaged or destroyed. Agricultural production had declined. Markets were uncertain. People struggled to feed their families. Many survived on subsistence farming and fishing, producing just enough to eat. The brief smuggling boom of the late 1940s provided temporary relief for some. As mentioned earlier, Yonaguni's location near Taiwan made it ideal for illegal trade. Goods flowed across the strait in both directions. The profits enriched a few while providing employment for others. But when American authorities cracked down, the boom collapsed. The population surge reversed. People left seeking opportunities elsewhere. By the 1950s, Yonaguni had settled into a pattern of slow recovery. The population stabilized at lower levels than before the war. Many young people migrated to larger islands or to the main islands of Japan seeking work. This outmigration drained the island of human resources. Those who remained tended to be older or unable to leave. Infrastructure improvements came gradually. Roads were repaired or built. Port facilities were upgraded modestly. Electricity became more reliable, though it remained limited. Communication links to the outside world improved. The island was no longer as isolated as it had been during the war, but it remained peripheral. The relationship between Okinawans and the American occupiers was complex. On one hand, the Americans provided aid and prevented starvation during the worst post-war years. On the other hand, they were foreign occupiers who requisitioned land and imposed their authority. Resentment and gratitude coexisted uneasily. For Yonaguni specifically, the American presence was less visible than on islands with major bases. Life returned to something resembling normalcy. People fished, they farmed, they raised families. The occupation was a political reality, but not a daily presence for most islanders. Political movements for reversion to Japan gained strength over the years. Okinawans wanted to rejoin the rest of the country. They resented being separated. The American bases were unwelcome. Economic development lagged behind the main islands. People felt they were second-class citizens in their own land. These sentiments were perhaps less intense on Yonaguni than on Okinawa main island, where the base presence was overwhelming. But even here, people wanted to return to being fully Japanese. They had been told in the Meiji era that they were Japanese. Now they wanted to exercise that identity fully. Negotiations between the United States and Japan over Okinawa's status continued through the 1960s. The Vietnam War made the bases strategically important to America. They were reluctant to give up control. But political pressure from both Okinawans and the Japanese government mounted. Eventually, an agreement was reached. On May 15, 1972, Okinawa Prefecture was returned to Japanese sovereignty. This included Yonaguni and all the other islands that had been under American administration. The reversion was celebrated throughout the prefecture. Flags were raised, ceremonies were held, people felt they had finally come home. However, reversion did not solve all problems. The American bases remained, now under treaty agreements between the United States and Japan. Economic disparities between Okinawa and the main islands persisted. Development lagged. For islands like Yonaguni, the change in administration made little practical difference in the short term. Fishing rights became an issue after reversion. The waters around Yonaguni had been fished by both Taiwanese and Okinawan boats during the occupation. Reversion meant these were now Japanese waters. Disputes over access and boundaries arose. Fishermen from Yonaguni found themselves competing with larger operations and navigating complex international maritime issues. Depopulation continued to be a concern. Young people still left for better opportunities elsewhere. The population aged. Schools had fewer students. The island's future seemed uncertain. Without economic development, how could the community sustain itself? Government programs aimed at rural development provided some assistance. Infrastructure projects brought work. Subsidies helped maintain unprofitable services. But these measures treated symptoms rather than addressing fundamental issues. The island remained marginal in economic and political terms. The post-war period and American administration represented a time of transition for Yonaguni. The old order was gone. The war had destroyed it. The occupation had created new realities. Reversion brought integration back into Japan, but integration as a peripheral province of a much larger nation. The island's struggle to find its place in the modern world continued. The challenges that began in the ashes of war would persist for decades to come. Post-war struggle and American administration. The war ended on August 15, 1945. For Yonaguni's people, the fighting had stopped, but survival remained a daily battle. The island lay in ruins. The airfields built during wartime had consumed much of the cultivated land. The herds of Yonaguni horses, animals the island had bred for centuries, had been nearly wiped out. Infrastructure lay scattered. Wells were contaminated. Fishing boats were gone. Homes were rubble. The American military arrived and established an occupation authority over all the Ryukyu Islands. This began a period that would last 27 years. The United States administered the islands directly, separate from mainland Japan. Yonaguni fell under this military government. The people had lost their nation, their infrastructure, and now faced administration by a foreign power speaking a foreign tongue. Life became makeshift. Communities rebuilt, using salvaged materials and whatever resources the American authorities provided. The traditional economy had collapsed. Fishing, which had sustained families for generations, took time to revive. Agricultural land needed restoration. The population faced food shortages. Rice was scarce. Trading networks that had connected the Ryukyus to China and other regions had been severed. Yet resilience emerged from hardship. Local leaders worked within the American system, slowly rebuilding institutions. Schools reopened. Fishing fleets were gradually reconstructed. The Yonaguni horse, though nearly extinct, was preserved by dedicated islanders who refused to let their heritage disappear. The American administration built new infrastructure. Ports were improved. Roads were constructed. These improvements brought connections to other islands and the outside world. Electricity arrived. Communications improved. Slowly, the island moved toward stability, though the economic strain remained severe. Culturally, the occupation brought change. American influence arrived alongside the troops. New foods, new habits, new languages mixed with traditional Ryukyuan ways. The younger generation grew up in this hybrid world. Okinawa became strategically vital to American military interests in the Pacific. Military bases became permanent features of the landscape. By the early 1960s, momentum was building toward change. Japan itself recovered from war, sought to restore its sovereignty over the Ryukyus. Negotiations began between the United States and Japan. The islanders, meanwhile, held deep feelings about their future. They were Ryukyuan first, but they were also Japanese. The question of where they belonged, politically and culturally, weighed heavily. On May 15, 1972, the agreement became reality. The United States returned administrative control of Okinawa and the surrounding islands, including Yonaguni, to Japan. 27 years of foreign military rule ended. But this transition brought its own difficulties. Infrastructure investments needed to be absorbed into the Japanese system. Economic integration had to occur. The military bases remained, which created ongoing tensions about land use and autonomy. For Yonaguni specifically, the reversion meant incorporation into Okinawa Prefecture as part of Japan proper. The island's isolation, both geographic and historical, finally ended. It became connected to national systems, national markets, national institutions. Yet this connection also meant that traditional ways faced increasing pressure from modernity. The fishing industry began to modernize. Young people left for better opportunities in cities. The traditional Yonaguni horse breed faced extinction again, this time from economic forces rather than war. Education became standardized according to national curriculum. Language shifted. The Ryukyuan dialect, spoken by elders, gave way to standard Japanese in schools. Tourism began to reshape the island's economy. Its remoteness, once a burden, became an asset. People began to visit these outer islands as retreats from urban life. Divers started exploring the waters around Yonaguni. The underwater world, largely unknown to the modern world, attracted adventurous swimmers and researchers, yet few knew what lay beneath the waves. The island's deeper mysteries remained hidden in the depths. Kihachiro Aratake and the Moment of Finding. In 1986, a local diver named Kihachiro Aratake was preparing a tour route off the western coast of Yonaguni. Aratake worked as an operator, taking visitors into the waters to experience marine life. He dove regularly around the island, exploring various depths and locations. On one dive in that year, below the surface where sunlight still reached but grew dim, his eyes caught something unusual. The formations before him did not match the typical seafloor. Straight lines appeared where only curves should exist. Flat surfaces rose in geometric patterns. Layers seemed arranged with intent. Aratake was familiar with natural rock formations. He knew how stone broke and crumbled underwater. Yet these structures seemed different. They suggested purpose. They suggested design. What Aratake encountered was a massive structure rising from the ocean floor. It extended roughly 150 meters in length. The formation displayed what appeared to be terraced levels, carved or fractured into distinct steps. There were what seemed to be straight walls. The overall dimensions suggested something far too deliberate to be accident. At the highest point, the structure rose about 5 meters above the surrounding seafloor, forming a distinct ridge. Local calls sometimes referred to it as a monument, though its true nature remained mysterious. Aratake's discovery ignited questions that spread through the diving community. Word of the underwater formation began to circulate among researchers and enthusiasts. Some visitors to the island heard about this enigma. Slowly, news reached academic circles. The formation was unlike anything previously documented in the region. Its origins were unclear. Its age was unknown. Its purpose, if it had one, remained hidden. In the following years, more dives explored the site. Other formations were found nearby. A structure dubbed the Palace lay not far away. The arch formation showed different characteristics. Additional sites scattered around the western and southern coasts suggested this was not an isolated oddity, but part of a larger complex. The seafloor around Yonaguni was beginning to reveal secrets. The formations became known as the Yonaguni Monument. Word spread in diving magazines and among the international diving community. People began traveling to Yonaguni specifically to see these underwater mysteries. Tour operators, including Aratake himself, began to establish regular dive routes to the site. The island, long isolated and economically struggling, found itself the subject of international curiosity. Yet this curiosity brought more than tourism. It brought science. Archaeologists heard about the discovery. Geologists became interested. The question that Aratake's dive had raised, are these structures natural or made by human hands, became urgent and impossible to ignore. The moment of discovery in 1986 marked a turning point for Yonaguni. The island's underwater features would transform it from a forgotten corner of Japan into a site of global scientific interest and debate. Yet the monument kept its secrets. Its true origin remained concealed beneath the dark waters, waiting for experts to arrive and attempt to unlock its mysteries. Enter the experts. The scientific community arrives. News of the underwater formations reached academic institutions throughout Japan and beyond. The University of the Ryukyus, located in the main city of Okinawa, took particular interest. A geologist named Masaki Kimura heard about Aratake's discovery and decided to investigate. In 1988, just 2 years after the initial finding, Kimura conducted his first scientific dive to the site. He came prepared with tools for measurement, photography, and detailed observation. What Kimura saw both fascinated and challenged him. The structures displayed features that demanded explanation. The main formation showed distinct levels, as if someone or something had deliberately removed stone to create steps. There were what appeared to be carved markings. Straight edges ran where rounded edges would form naturally. Geometric patterns suggested intentional arrangement. Kimura was not alone in his observations. Over the following years, other academics visited the site. International researchers joined Japanese scholars in examining the monument. Diving technology improved, allowing for better photography and measurement. Scientific papers began to appear in journals. Conferences featured discussions of the Yonaguni formations. The early academic response divided into two broad camps. One view held that the structures showed signs of human workmanship. The geometric precision, the apparent terracing, the flat surfaces, all suggested that ancient people might have carved or constructed these features. This perspective gained support from scholars who believed the formations were too regular to have formed naturally. The other view insisted that geological processes alone could explain everything observed. Natural rock breaks along planes of weakness. Currents and erosion carve patterns. Earthquakes fracture stone in angular ways. Tectonic activity can create distinct layers and rises. From this perspective, the Yonaguni Monument was a natural wonder shaped by the forces that build and break stone on the ocean floor. Kimura, positioned in the middle of these debates, conducted systematic surveys. He documented features with photographs and measurements. He attempted to date the formations using geological techniques. He visited similar sites in other parts of the world to draw comparisons. Gradually, his research suggested to him that human hands had shaped these stones. He became the most prominent voice arguing for an anthropogenic origin. Other researchers approached the evidence differently. Geologist Robert Schoch, an expert in erosion and stone formation, traveled to Yonaguni to study the site firsthand. Schoch had expertise in understanding how water, weather, and seismic activity sculpted landscapes. When he examined the monument, his training pointed toward natural explanations. The debate attracted media attention. Documentaries were filmed. Television programs featured the mystery. The international press picked up the story. Here was a real scientific mystery. Genuine scholars with genuine credentials disagreed about what the evidence showed. The Yonaguni Monument became a symbol of the unknown, a place where our understanding of the past remained incomplete. Scientific committees formed to study the site more formally. More detailed surveys were conducted. Technology improved further, allowing high-resolution imaging and 3D mapping. Yet the more evidence that accumulated, the more both sides felt supported in their positions. Each new measurement, each new photograph, each new analysis seemed to confirm what believers in that view already suspected. The scientific community's arrival transformed the Yonaguni Monument from a local curiosity into an international question. It moved from the realm of tourism into the sphere of academic debate. The island found itself hosting researchers from universities around the world. Funding became available for study. The mystery had become prestigious enough to warrant serious scholarly attention. Yet despite this attention, the fundamental question remained unresolved. The experts had arrived, but they had not reached consensus. The mystery deepened with knowledge rather than dissolving beneath it. The case for a lost civilization, Professor Kimura's arguments. Professor Masaki Kimura brought decades of geological experience to the Yonaguni site. His studies of the formations led him to propose a startling hypothesis. According to his research, the structures showed evidence of deliberate human construction dating back approximately 8,000 years ago, during a period when sea levels were lower and the site would have been on dry land or partially submerged. Kimura's main arguments rested on several key observations. First, the main structure displayed a series of flat terraces rising in distinct steps. These terraces, he argued, showed too much regularity to result from random erosion. Natural fracturing would create rough, uneven surfaces. Yet here, the surfaces were relatively smooth and level. Second, the walls bounding these terraces showed straight lines. In nature, such consistent straightness is rare unless stone breaks along inherent planes or unless something has shaped it deliberately. The main terrace was perhaps the most striking feature in Kimura's analysis. This formation stretched hundreds of meters across the seafloor. It displayed what appeared to be carved paths or ramps leading down in stages. Kimura interpreted these as intentional construction, roads or access routes built to move across the structure. He pointed to the parallel walls on either side of these pathways as evidence of planning and labor. Kimura also identified what he called a stadium formation, a large flat area surrounded by rises that could have served as a gathering space or ceremonial center. He noted what appeared to be a pyramid-shaped formation at another location. These structures, taken together, suggested to him not random geology, but the work of an organized society with engineering knowledge and the capacity for major construction projects. The carvings added another layer to Kimura's argument. Certain formations displayed markings that appeared deliberate. Star-shaped patterns appeared in some places. Linear cuts suggested tool marks. Symbols seemed to repeat in ways that would indicate communication or meaning-making. Kimura studied these marks closely and argued that they represented intentional creation rather than natural effects of erosion. One controversial aspect of Kimura's work involved his dating of the structures. He proposed that these formations dated to around 8,000 years ago, possibly earlier. This would place their construction during a time when the Ryukyus were inhabited by humans, though our knowledge of civilization at that period remains limited. Kimura suggested that a sophisticated culture existed in the region, one capable of moving massive stones and creating architectural features, but that this culture was lost to history, buried beneath rising seas and the passage of millennia. Kimura's hypothesis proposed that a sophisticated pre-dynastic culture had inhabited the Ryukyus. This civilization, according to his interpretation, possessed knowledge of construction and organization that exceeded what we typically attribute to people of that era. They built structures aligned with astronomical features. They created monuments of ritual or ceremonial significance. Then, whether through natural catastrophe or the rising of the seas themselves, this civilization disappeared. Their works remained, preserved underwater as silent testimony to their existence. To Kimura, the Yonaguni Monument represented not geological accident but archaeological evidence, ruins of a lost world that history had forgotten. The precision he observed, the planning evident in the layout, the apparent intentionality of design, all supported this narrative. The monument was not a puzzle to be explained away by geological process, but a message from the deep past, waiting for modern humans to read it. Kimura published his findings and presented them at academic conferences. His work attracted international attention, particularly from people interested in lost civilizations and ancient mysteries. Some scholars embraced his conclusions enthusiastically. Others remained skeptical, but granted that his observations deserved serious consideration. His arguments formed the core of the man-made interpretation that would dominate popular discussions of the site for decades. The naturalist counter-argument, Professor Schoch's analysis. Robert Schoch brought to the Yonaguni question a different expertise and a different perspective. As a geologist trained in erosional processes, rock formation, and earth science, Schoch approached the monument not as an archaeologist seeking evidence of human activity, but as a scientist examining natural stone. When he traveled to Yonaguni and studied the site, his training suggested alternative explanations. Schoch's central argument began with a simple principle. Geology is far more dynamic and complex than casual observation might suggest. Natural processes create straight lines, flat surfaces, and geometric patterns far more often than people realize. Rock breaks along planes of weakness called joint systems. Water flowing over stone creates terraces. Erosion follows predictable patterns that can appear intentional. Earthquakes fracture stone in angular, step-like fashion. Tectonic movements shift and tilt formations. All these processes, operating over long periods, can produce structures remarkably similar to those seen at Yonaguni. The terraces, in Schoch's view, resulted from the stone's internal structure. Sandstone and mudstone, which compose much of Yonaguni, break naturally along bedding planes. These planes are the layers in which the rock formed, often visible as horizontal strata. When erosion removes the softer material between these planes, they become exposed as distinct steps or terraces. This is not human carving, but the stone's natural breakdown following its grain. The straight walls that seemed so striking to proponents of the human origin theory, Schoch argued, merely reflected the stone's joint systems, the natural fractures that run through rock. When stone breaks along these existing fractures, the resulting edges are straight because the fractures themselves are straight. Underwater currents, particularly the strong flows common to the area around Yonaguni, accelerate this erosion. They exploit the joints, enlarging them, deepening them, eventually creating the appearance of walls. Schoch examined the supposed carving marks and symbology that Kimura highlighted. In Schoch's assessment, these marks were natural features, scratches created by water and sediment, patterns formed by erosion, or simple optical illusions resulting from light and shadow underwater. Human-carved symbols would show characteristics that these formations did not. Consistent depth, clear intent reflected in repetition, and evidence of tool contact. The marks at Yonaguni, Schoch maintained, were too irregular and too variable to represent intentional inscription. The dating presented another critical issue in Schoch's rebuttal. He argued that even if the structures were human-made, the timeline Kimura proposed did not fit available evidence. The oldest undisputed archaeological evidence for civilization in the Ryukyus dates to much later periods. There is no known pottery, no tools, no settlements, and no clear evidence of a sophisticated building culture capable of moving stones at the time Kimura suggested. The gap between what archaeology shows existed and what Kimura's hypothesis required was too large to bridge. Furthermore, Schock pointed out that the Yonaguni Monument shows no weathering patterns consistent with 8,000 years of exposure to seawater and time. Carved stone ages in distinctive ways. Surface textures change. Exposed fresh stone created by carving looks different from stone naturally broken by erosion. Schock's examination suggested that the features were more recently formed than Kimura's hypothesis would require. The geological setting also supported a natural explanation, in Schock's view. The Ryukyus sit in a seismically active zone. Earthquakes are frequent. The tectonic forces in this region are powerful enough to create mountains and shift landscapes. Underwater, these forces continue. Seismic activity could have broken and shifted the rock into the configurations seen today. Combined with erosion over thousands of years, even tens of thousands of years, natural geology alone could account for everything observed. Schock also examined similar formations around the world and noted numerous examples of natural rock formations that resembled the Yonaguni structures. The Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland shows organized columnar formations despite being entirely natural. The Wave in Arizona displays impossible-seeming geometric beauty without human intervention. Mesa Verde in Colorado presents cliff dwellings that are human, but the natural formations surrounding them are equally striking. Nature, Schock emphasized, is a master architect in its own right. In Schock's conclusion, the Yonaguni Monument required no lost civilization to explain it. The evidence supported natural formation through the combined effects of erosion, joint systems, tectonic activity, and the powerful currents surrounding this remote island. The appearance of design, he argued, was a product of human psychology, our tendency to see patterns and intention even where none exists. The mystery, from this view, dissolved when approached with disciplined geological analysis. The heart of the debate: stairways, terraces, and the turtle. The debate between Kimura and Schock crystallized around specific features that both scholars examined differently. These features became focal points where evidence seemed clearest, but interpretation remained most contested. Each suggested something different depending on whether one approached it as evidence of ancient work or as geological artifact. The main terrace exemplified this disagreement. This formation dominated the site, stretching hundreds of meters. It displayed stepped surfaces that rose in distinct increments. To Kimura, these steps represented intentional carving, a grand staircase or a series of processing platforms built by an ancient society. The regularity of the steps, their consistent height and width, suggested planning and execution by human hands. Quarrying marks on some surfaces seemed to show where stone had been extracted. The overall effect was of a vast monument to lost knowledge and forgotten power. Schock examined the same terrace with different eyes. The steps, he noted, follow the natural bedding planes of the sandstone. The stone breaks this way because of how it formed, layer by layer, millions of years ago. Differential erosion, where some layers are softer than others, creates the step-like appearance as water removes the weaker material. The consistency of the steps reflected consistency in the stone layers, not evidence of uniformity in human labor. What Kimura saw as carving marks, Schock identified as natural weathering and the effects of moving water carrying sediment. Another contested feature was identified as a stairway. This formation showed a series of rises and falls, almost ladder-like in appearance. Proponents of the human hypothesis argued that this represented a carefully engineered access route. The treads appeared level. The risers seemed consistent. Someone, the argument went, had built this to allow people to climb the formation. The craftsmanship implied organized effort and technical knowledge. Yet the stairway could also be explained through natural processes. Fractured sandstone and mudstone break into angular pieces that can stack or align in step-like patterns. Underwater currents that flow regularly across formations have preferred directions. These currents exploit weak points, eroding along joint systems, creating channels and breaks that align in certain directions. Over time, the result resembles construction, even though no builder ever intended it. A formation affectionately called the turtle drew particular attention. Its outline suggested an animal viewed from above: a head, four limbs, a tail. The shape was recognizable, almost familiar. To believers in human construction, the turtle represented ancient sculpting, a portrait or sacred animal rendered in stone, preserved for thousands of years. The artist who created it had achieved such skill that the identification remained clear millennia later. To geologists, the turtle was what it appeared to be: a coincidence of erosion, rock fractures in ways that sometimes approximate organic forms. Water flows over the surface in patterns that accentuate certain features and wear away others. The result can be remarkably lifelike without any intention behind it. The human mind, finely tuned to recognize animals through a lifetime of experience, readily sees meaning in random shapes. Pareidolia, the psychological phenomenon of seeing faces or familiar forms in random patterns, was likely at work. The turtle was geology, not art. This same disagreement applied to smaller features throughout the site. What one side interpreted as deliberate marking, the other saw as natural weathering. Where one perspective found evidence of purpose, the other found evidence of time and erosion. Each new examination seemed to generate more questions than answers. The core issue was epistemological, about how we know what we think we know. Both Kimura and Schock possessed genuine expertise, both had studied the site, both had measured and photographed, yet they arrived at opposite conclusions. The evidence itself did not speak clearly. Evidence required interpretation, and interpretation required assumptions about what natural processes could accomplish and what human hands must have done. The turtle formation perhaps best illustrated this impasse. Its recognizable shape was undeniable. Yet recognition does not prove creation. The question remained: does a formation's resemblance to a turtle indicate that someone carved a turtle, or does it simply show that erosion and human pattern recognition can make random geology appear designed? This question, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable with existing evidence, remained the heart of the Yonaguni mystery. Beyond the main monument, other underwater sites in the vicinity. The Yonaguni Monument was not alone. As exploration continued, other formations appeared on the seafloor around the island. These secondary sites complicated the analysis. If Kimura's hypothesis was correct, these formations suggested a larger complex, an entire built environment constructed by an ancient civilization. If Schock's interpretation held, they demonstrated the remarkable ability of natural geology to create multiple similar structures across a region. One significant site became known as the Palace. This formation lay at a different location south of the main monument. The palace displayed certain similarities to the main structure, but with distinctive features of its own. It showed what appeared to be inner chambers or rooms. Walls seemed to define spaces. The arrangement suggested a three-dimensional structure, not merely horizontal platforms. If intentionally built, the palace might have served as a residence or ritual space for the people who occupied this lost civilization. Kimura studied the palace carefully. He saw in its features confirmation of his hypothesis. Here was construction more obviously building-like than the main monument. The spatial arrangement suggested purpose beyond simple terracing. The palace, combined with the main monument and other sites, implied an organized settlement, a place where people lived and worked and maintained structures built for specific functions. Schock approached the palace differently. The rooms and chambers could result from selective erosion. Water flows through an uneven surface in the most efficient paths. It carves deeper here, less there, creating the appearance of chambers or corridors. The walls bounding these spaces might be joint systems exposed by water action. What appeared to be a building might be the natural result of geological process and hydraulic action. Another formation identified as the arch presented yet another puzzle. This formation displayed an opening or void in the stone. An arch, in human architecture, represents sophisticated engineering, understanding of load distribution and structural principles. An arch is not a simple or accidental form, yet Schock could explain it through natural geology. Stone naturally breaks, leaving voids. Differential erosion can undercut a formation, leaving a bridge or arch-like structure. These form without intention, through the simple laws of physics and the persistence of water. Researchers identified additional smaller sites scattered around Yonaguni's coast. Some showed terraces similar to the main monument. Others displayed unusual formations difficult to categorize. The cumulative effect of these discoveries was to expand the scope of the mystery. Either Yonaguni contained evidence of a vast, organized society that had built multiple structures, or it contained multiple examples of how varied and striking natural geology could be. The pattern of the sites added interpretive weight to both arguments. From Kimura's perspective, clustering suggested settlement. Civilizations build multiple structures in the same region for access to resources or strategic advantage. Yonaguni possessed good harbors, fishing grounds, and fresh water. It made sense that an ancient society would establish a settlement here. Multiple monuments implied multiple functions within a complex culture. From Schock's view, clustering reflected geological consistency. If the island's geology produces the forms seen at the main monument through natural processes, then other locations with similar geology would produce similar results. The sites clustered not because humans chose them, but because the stone itself dictated where formations would appear. Different areas of the island had different geological composition, leading to different formation patterns. The map of sites simply reflected the island's geological diversity. Another critical observation involved the secondary site's relative preservation. Some formations appeared sharper and fresher than others. If all had been carved 8,000 years ago, one might expect more uniform weathering. The variation in preservation suggested either recent modification or that sites had formed at different times through different processes. This observation seemed to favor the natural hypothesis, recent formations alongside older ones, all created by ongoing geological processes. Yet supporters of the human hypothesis noted that the ocean environment is not uniform. Currents flow differently in different locations. Some areas experience greater silt deposition, others face more direct water flow. Depth variations affect pressure and chemical composition. These environmental differences could explain why some structures appeared better preserved than others, even if all had been constructed in the same ancient period. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, research had identified multiple secondary sites that expanded the mystery. Each new finding seemed to support both interpretations while satisfying neither side completely. The sites could be explained as a lost city or as a geological marvel. The evidence allowed for both readings. The truth remained submerged, waiting for some breakthrough in evidence or analysis that had not yet appeared. Context and comparisons. Global parallels and anomalies. To understand Yonaguni better, scholars examined other underwater sites and geological formations around the world. Some showed suspicious similarities. Others differed in ways that clarified the mystery. One frequently mentioned comparison involved Dwarka, located off the coast of India. Dwarka's underwater structures had generated their own debates about human origin versus natural formation. Some researchers reported finding walls, artificial structures, and organized layouts beneath the waves. Others argued these were natural geological formations. The comparison was instructive, even with ancient texts and historical records suggesting Dwarka's existence. Determining what the ocean floor showed remained contentious. Off the coast of Cuba, underwater formations similarly sparked debate. Some researchers identified formations they interpreted as pyramidal structures or built environments. Like Yonaguni, these sites became synonymous with lost civilizations and alternative history. The Cuban underwater formations also remained interpreted differently by different experts. No definitive answer emerged. These global comparisons suggested that underwater structures inherently resisted straightforward interpretation. Water distorts vision and makes measurement difficult. Lighting underwater creates illusions. The scale of features is hard to judge. Geological processes create forms that surprise us in their geometric precision. The human eye, primed to find meaning, readily imposes intention on ambiguous shapes. Yet the comparisons also highlighted what made Yonaguni distinctive. The formation was not isolated. Clusters of features surrounded it. The formations showed remarkable consistency and scale. Kimura's measurements indicated precision that was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. These features did seem different from the scattered remnants reported at many other sites. Natural geological formations provided another important comparison. The Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland displayed thousands of basalt columns formed naturally. Each column was roughly hexagonal in cross section. The precision and regularity were extraordinary, yet entirely explained by the cooling patterns of lava. The formations inspired awe and wonder, yet no one disputed their natural origin. The wave in Arizona created recognizable forms without human intervention. Rock layers bent and folded, creating patterns of stunning beauty and clear geometric organization. Yet the formation was undeniably natural, the result of tectonic forces and differential erosion. The wave demonstrated that geology could produce forms more striking and organized than many human works. These comparisons suggested caution about assuming human involvement. Nature was capable of creating remarkable things. Regularity and organization did not necessarily indicate intention. At the same time, the comparisons could not definitively rule out human involvement at Yonaguni. The site retained features that seemed to exceed what natural processes typically produced. The underwater setting itself created comparative challenges. Most famous geological formations existed on land where they could be fully examined. Yonaguni lay 25 meters below the surface. The darkness, the pressure, the current, and the difficulties of underwater photography made examination imperfect. Divers could observe, but could not engage in the full range of analytical techniques available to land-based geologists. This limitation meant that some questions might never be fully answered. One important context involved the state of knowledge about sea level changes. During the last ice age, sea levels were dramatically lower than today. Yonaguni's current depth underwater would have been at or above ground level when glaciers locked away much of the planet's water. This meant that if the structures were human-made, they might have been built on dry land during that period. Rising sea levels would later submerge them. The feasibility of such construction depended on when it occurred. If humans built the structures 10,000 or 15,000 years ago when sea levels were lower, the structures would have been coastal or terrestrial initially. The evidence for human settlement in the Ryukyus at such early dates, however, remained limited. Archaeological sites from this period were rare. The oldest pottery found in the region dated to much later. This archaeological context was crucial. Civilization leaves traces. Pottery, tools, weapons, bones, settlements, and burial sites all accumulate in the archaeological record. The Ryukyus showed clear evidence of human habitation going back thousands of years. Yet the record did not extend back far enough or show complexity sufficient to match Kimura's hypothesis of sophisticated monument building 8,000 years ago. This gap between what geology might suggest and what archaeology demonstrated remained a significant problem for advocates of human construction. Global context, therefore, suggested both caution and ambiguity. The world contained remarkable natural formations and mysterious underwater sites. Yonaguni was distinctive but not unique. The comparison to similar sites worldwide neither confirmed nor disproved any theory. Yonaguni remained, in global context, an unusual but not unprecedented puzzle. The modern mystery, tourism, research, and unanswered questions. By the early 2000s, Yonaguni had transformed. The remote island was no longer merely a struggling fishing village. It had become a destination. Divers traveled from across the world to explore the monument and the surrounding formations. Tourism became crucial to the local economy. Hotels and restaurants appeared, dive shops opened. The island's isolation, once an economic burden, became an asset attracting adventurous travelers. Kihachiro Aratake, the original discoverer, became a prominent figure in this new tourism economy. He led dives to the site, shared his experience with visitors, and maintained his position as a crucial link between the scientific community and the diving public. The discovery that had emerged from his daily work as a tour operator had given his island and his livelihood a new purpose. Yet, tourism brought complexity. The site itself was at risk. Divers leave marks, sediment is disturbed, marine life is affected by repeated visits. The formations that sparked such intense debate might be damaged in the process of studying and experiencing them. Concerns about preservation grew. How could the site be protected while remaining accessible? How could tourism be managed to prevent harm? The scientific investigation remained sporadic and limited. Funding for research was inconsistent. Major universities did not maintain permanent research programs at Yonaguni. Studies occurred in bursts when individual researchers obtained grants or funding. Most of the year, the site received minimal scientific attention. Researchers from Kimura's laboratory visited periodically. Other academics conducted occasional expeditions, but there was no organized, continuous program to deepen understanding. The questions that had motivated investigation in the 1980s and 1990s remained largely unresolved in the 2000s and 2010s. The monument's origin remained disputed. Its age remained uncertain. Its purpose, if it had one, remained obscure. New dives generated new photographs and measurements, but did not generate new consensus. Advanced technology offered some hope. Three-dimensional mapping improved. Sonar and other sensing technologies were developed. High-resolution photography captured details invisible to the naked eye. Yet even with these tools, interpretative disagreements persisted. The data did not speak for itself. Different experts continued to read the evidence differently. One persistent challenge involved the lack of associated artifacts. If humans had built the structures, where were their tools? Where were their pottery fragments? Where were their bones or burial sites? Underwater archaeology at other sites had recovered objects that confirmed human presence and activity. Yet Yonaguni yielded no such evidence. The structures existed, but nothing clearly showed human hands had made them. This absence of artifacts was significant. Archaeologists rely on material culture to understand the past. Even when a site is submerged and disturbed, fragments typically survive. Ceramic ware is particularly durable. Metal does not decompose. Stone tools persist. Yet searching Yonaguni's monument and surrounding seafloor had not yielded pottery from the proposed period of construction. No tools were found. No ornaments or decorative items emerged. The silence of the archaeological record contrasted sharply with the apparent monumentality of the structures. If Yonaguni truly represented a sophisticated civilization, where was the evidence of that civilization's material life? This absence led skeptical archaeologists to maintain doubts about the human origin hypothesis. At the same time, underwater conditions could explain the absence of artifacts. Currents might have carried away loose objects. Sediment could have buried them. Acidic water and long submersion might have destroyed some materials. The ocean floor was not a perfect preserver of the past. Objects could disappear or become unrecognizable. This reality meant that absence of evidence was not definitive evidence of absence. Tourism and research coexisted uneasily. Researchers wanted controlled access to gather data systematically. The tourism industry wanted open access to maximize visitors and revenue. The local community balanced economic benefits against cultural and environmental concerns. The monument had become simultaneously a scientific puzzle, an economic resource, and a cultural symbol. Managing these competing interests remained a constant challenge. Popular media embraced the mystery enthusiastically. Television documentaries portrayed Yonaguni as evidence of lost civilizations. Books explored alternative histories suggesting advanced ancient cultures. Internet forums debated the monument endlessly. The general public, captivated by the unknown, had adopted the site as a symbol of hidden history. This popular interest sometimes conflicted with the measured skepticism of professional scientists. Academic journals published occasional papers presenting new evidence or reanalyzing existing data, yet breakthroughs remained elusive. No smoking gun emerged. No discovery settled the question definitively. The monument remained mysterious by its nature and resistant to the neat categorization that science often seeks. By the 2010s and 2020s, a kind of equilibrium had emerged. The monument was accepted as unusual and warranting further study. It attracted researchers and divers. It brought income to the local economy. Yet the central question, are these structures natural or human-made, remained open. The scientific community had not reached consensus. The monuments had not given up their secrets. The questions that persisted were fundamental. How old were the structures, truly? What processes had shaped them? If human hands were involved, when did construction occur and who built it? If natural forces alone were responsible, could we understand the complete process? Why did some formations appear so regular and intentional? What did this tell us about the limits of human pattern recognition and our tendency to find meaning in randomness? These questions transformed Yonaguni from a simple archaeological or geological curiosity into something deeper, a test of how we interpret evidence, construct narratives about the past, and distinguish between what we observe and what we assume. The monument became a mirror reflecting our methods of understanding the world. Legacy of the Stones, Yonaguni's place in human history. Decades after Aratake's discovery, the Yonaguni Monument had secured a place in how we think about the past. Yet its legacy was complex and multifaceted, resisting simple interpretation just as the monument itself resisted simple explanation. From an archaeological perspective, Yonaguni represented either a profound gap in the historical record or evidence of how much remained unknown. If Kimura was correct, the structures testified to a lost civilization that had existed and then disappeared from history. This civilization had possessed knowledge and capability that modern archaeology had not documented. Its works survived while its people, its culture, its language, and its memory had vanished. It suggested that human history was far more complex and mysterious than we typically acknowledged. Yet the absence of corroborating evidence troubled many scholars. Civilizations left traces, pottery endured, settlements revealed themselves through stratigraphy. Even when submerged, archaeological sites typically yielded artifacts and bones. The Yonaguni site's silence on this matter was deafening. This silence suggested to many that the structures were natural rather than human, and that we were witnessing the power of geology and the human mind's tendency toward pattern recognition rather than the lost legacy of ancient society. From a geological perspective, Yonaguni demonstrated both the predictability and the surprise inherent in how stone behaves. Erosion follows laws, fracturing follows patterns, yet the results can be unexpected and remarkable. Natural processes could create structures that seemed designed. Beauty and organization emerged from chaos through nothing more than time and physical forces. In this sense, Yonaguni was a triumph of geology, evidence of how magnificent nature could be when given sufficient time and the right conditions. Yet, even from this view, questions remained. Could all features be fully explained through known geological processes? Were there aspects of the site that pressed the boundaries of typical natural formation? Scientists continued to debate whether the specific characteristics of Yonaguni required some additional explanation, or whether patience and careful analysis would eventually demonstrate that standard geology was sufficient. For the people of Yonaguni, the monument had become central to their modern identity. Once the island was known for fishing, for the Yonaguni horse, for quiet remoteness. Now it was the island with the mystery. Visitors came specifically to see the underwater formations. The local economy had transformed around this single feature. Young people who might have left could now find work as dive guides or in tourism support. The island's future, once uncertain, had become more secure through the monument's fame. This transformation brought both benefits and costs. Tourism income was real and substantial, but cultural change accompanied it. Traditional ways were pressured by the need to accommodate visitors and modern economic systems. The younger generation's connection to ancestral practices weakened. Language, diet, and customs changed as outside influences intensified. The monument brought prosperity but also disruption. Culturally and spiritually, Yonaguni's monument had acquired significance for many people beyond what science could measure. Some viewed it as evidence of spiritual or cosmic meaning. Others saw it as a testament to human potential, proof that ancient peoples possessed more knowledge and capability than mainstream history acknowledged. Still others found in it a reminder that much remained unknown, that mystery persisted in our world, and that certainty was often an illusion. These meanings existed independently of whether the structures were natural or human-made. The mystery itself had value. In a modern world where so much seemed known and mapped and explained, Yonaguni offered something increasingly rare, genuine enigma. It represented the unknown. It suggested that discovery remained possible, that surprising truths might still lie hidden, and that not all questions had been answered. The scientific debate showed no signs of resolution. Neither Kimura's view nor Schock's had triumphed. New evidence did not decisively favor either perspective. The monument had become what might be called an undecidable question, one where the available evidence could support multiple interpretations, and where stronger evidence might not emerge without new technology or unexpected discoveries. This undecidability was itself instructive. It demonstrated the limits of interpretation and the role of assumption in how we understand evidence. Two equally trained, equally intelligent scholars could examine the same physical reality and reach opposite conclusions. This was not a failure of science, but a feature of how inquiry actually works. Evidence does not speak unambiguously. All observation requires interpretation. All interpretation involves choices about what to privilege and what to minimize. For the broader world, Yonaguni represented the enduring appeal of mystery. Human beings have always been fascinated by the unknown. Legends and myths emerged from the gaps in knowledge. As science has illuminated one mystery after another, the remaining unknowns have become more precious. Yonaguni was among the last great mysteries accessible to ordinary people. You could visit it, you could dive to it, you could see it with your own eyes. Yet it retained its mystery. The monument also served as a reminder of how much ancient history remained hidden. The oceans cover most of the planet's surface. The seafloor has been mapped in detail only recently. How many other sites exist, submerged and unknown? How many sunken cities or settlements lie beneath the waves, unexcavated and unexamined? Yonaguni suggested that the past held far more than we had yet discovered. In a broader sense, the legacy of Yonaguni's stones was philosophical. The structures, whether natural or human-made, embodied questions about evidence, interpretation, and certainty. They challenged simple narratives. They resisted easy explanation. They invited continued investigation and open-minded inquiry. They suggested that even in the modern era, with advanced technology and scientific training, mystery persisted. The debate itself, the serious disagreement between capable experts, was part of the monument's meaning. Science does not always produce consensus quickly. Questions can remain genuinely open. Different scholars can examine the same evidence and reach different conclusions. This was not a flaw in the scientific process, but an indication of its integrity. Scientists followed evidence where it seemed to lead, even when that led to disagreement with colleagues. For those who visited Yonaguni, the experience was often transformative. Descending into the dark blue water, approaching the massive structures, circling them in the dim light, many divers reported a sense of awe and wonder. Whether the formations were carved by human hands 10,000 years ago or shaped by nature over millions of years, they inspired profound respect. They connected visitors to deep time and to the vastness of history. The monument embodied the enduring mystery of human origins and the Earth's past. It stood as a question mark in the seafloor. It suggested that history was stranger and more complex than simplified narratives allowed. It showed that knowledge was provisional and that certainty often masked uncertainty. It demonstrated that wonder remained possible. The structures of Yonaguni, resting in their underwater home, continued their silent existence. Divers visited them, researchers studied them. The debate persisted, and the stones kept their secrets, indifferent to human interpretation, mysterious in their origins, powerful in their effect on those who encountered them. They remained what they had always been, features of a place where earth and water met, where human curiosity encountered the limits of its ability to answer, and where genuine mystery endured in the modern world.